Museum. This is a new edition. They're going to have a 40-foot screen there for a motion picture film with the Air Force history, but it's not open as yet. And as you can see, the time is not right. The wind is blowing terribly. It is now 10:24, April the 15th, 1991. We'll go inside the shadow on this, but we'll attempt to read it. This will begin our Air Force Museum tour. It says, man's dream of powered flight was not realized until the beginning of the 20th century with the flights of the Wright brothers. In 1909, on the parade ground at Fort Myers, Virginia, the United States Air Force first powered aircraft took flight to begin the first faltering steps to advance American military aviation. This is the story of the dedicated men and women who created and nurtured the evolving United States Air Force and who today sustain it in the pursuit of peace for all. 1909, Wright Brothers Flyer, which is an advanced version of the first one that was flown. As you can see, it's still on the track with the skids to create the landing. This was the first airplane demonstrated to the United States Army Air Corps in 1909. This is a replica. Alright, we'll continue on. Maybe we can get out of some of the groups here. This is a 1911 model Wright Brothers B Flyer. And you can see it is advanced from the skid and the type of takeoff with the sled to where they have wheels on this one now. This is the Wright Brothers Model B. Another 1911 model. This is a Curtiss Model D pusher plane. It was tried, but you see the landing gear now has the tricycle landing gear, the small wheel in front and the two in back. And this is the 2 years of progress that's been made. However, the government only bought one of these type airplanes, the Curtiss 1911 Model D. Court Model 28, and this was the first airplane flown in combat by American forces during the First World War. Here is the Curtiss. This is a Model JN, and it was the plane the old barnstormers used to fly. It was first used in 1916 by General Pershing as he went into Mexico. Famous World War I airplane. 3-engine bomber, and it was developed by an Italian designer in 1914. And you can see the pilot and the gunner in the front of it, and they had light bombs. They'd actually throw the bombs overboard. But this was one of the prototypes of the first bombers used in the war. Fought without a Sopwith Camel. If we only had Snoopy here. This is the famous Sopwith Camel, English made. Both the English, French, and American forces used this airplane. French Spad, model number 7, used by the famous French flyer Lafayette Escadrille, a French ace. These planes too were flown by all Allied forces during the First World War. The French built, flown by also the English and by the American pilots. Was placed on the grave of Lieutenant Quentin Roosevelt. He was shot down by the Germans just behind the French lines in 1918. The Germans found his body in the crash of the airplane. They buried him and took some of the basswood wood from the airplane and fashioned a cross which was placed in his grave. His brother, Teddy Roosevelt II, later died of a heart attack just after the Normandy invasion of World War II. And the grave of Quentin Roosevelt was removed, and both sons of Theodore Roosevelt are buried together in France. Above is just a model of an early airplane. I can't tell you the name of it, but you can see the wheels and the dragger on the tail. and they were all framed in wood. As the engine propeller was mounted in front of the instrument panel cockpit, but everything was, frame was all made out of wood. And in fact, it's a model SPAD 16. It's a two-seater. You can see the gun turned on the back where the gunner would sit behind the pilot. This plane was the personal airplane of General Billy Mitchell, who gained fame in the Second World War. But this is his personal plane, which he used as an observatory plane because of its two seats during the First World War. The SPAD Model 16. Eberhart Model SE-5E. It was an English-designed airplane. America bought the design rights to it, and Curtiss Aircraft Company in America assembled some of these for our Air Force during World War I. This plane was second only to the Sopwith Camel as far as air battles and air aces and everything scored in the First World War, but it's an Eberhart. Blimp that was used as an observation aircraft. These things would go up to about 4,000 feet, and I'll have to move around and get a picture of the gondola under it. But they were easily maneuvered, and quite a few of these were used during World War I as observation planes. The gondola suspended behind this, it's a Cabot observation balloon. These were actually designed in World War I. But this balloon was actually made in 1944 by the British and was used for observation and also for parachute testing. Homing pigeon called Long John, or called Stumpy John Silver. This pigeon carried many messages, and on one time he was shot at, lost a leg, but he still returned with the message. A model airplane produced in 1924. It was an amphibious. This one is named the San Francisco, and about 45 of these were bought at a cost of $24,000. Many were sent to Hawaii and to the Philippines, where they were used to island hop between the late 1920s and the middle 1930s. DH-4, the only American-built and designed aircraft to see service during World War I. About 1,200 of these were built. 420 of them saw action during the World War I. After the war, many of these were modified, and if you've seen the early movies of the old Airmail Express, these were used as some of the first mail planes in service in the United States. This is the private plane of Chief of the Air Service, Major General Patrick. This was his private airplane, but many of these were the early airmail planes that were used in the 20s and early 30s. This is a Boeing B-12, quite an airplane, built in the 30s, retired in 1940. While it was a fighter plane, it never saw any actual combat experience during the decade of the 30s. It was retired before World War I. Curtiss P-6 Hawk, and again, this was one of the better airplanes developed during the 30s. It was the last of the bi-wing fighter planes. And after this one was built, the later models all had the mono wings with a single wing for the fighter planes. 1930 model. Curtiss P-6 Hawk. This is the bomber, one of the first that they had. It was a B-10. The B-10 and the B-12 were quite similar. And if you've ever seen the movies of the bombing of Pearl Harbor, you've probably noticed a great number of these B-10s and B-12s on the ground there that were bombed by the Japanese and destroyed. So-38. It was an observation airplane. Carried a pilot and an observer. Had bi-wings, a closed cockpit. This was the first airplane that was taken to Alaska, arriving there in the late 1930s. And this one crashed in Alaska in 1941. The pilot and the observer were not injured. The observer mechanic was not injured. They hitchhiked back to the base. The airplane laid in the wilderness until 1968, when some friends of the museum learned about it, the existence. They went in, lifted it out, and even after the exposure of 27 years, the airplane was in remarkably good condition and has been restored and is here on exhibit here at the Air Force Museum. This airplane actually crashed in Alaska in 1940. The UC-43 Traveler. Many of these were used, of course, in the Alaska wilderness. In Canada, they were outfitted with, some of them with skis and some of them with pontoons. But it's an executive type airplane. The Air Corps used it as that to haul dignitaries and observers. But look at the unusual wings. It's an offset wing of airplanes. This one that we're looking at now is a Seversky P-35. It's a single-seat pursuit airplane. It was the first metal cockpit enclosed pursuit airplane with a retractable front landing gear. These went into service in 1937, and in 1938, 75 of these were assigned to the 1st Pursuit Group in Selfish Field, Michigan. But this was the forerunner of the P-47, famous fighter of World War II. P-35. Hawk. This airplane was made in 1938. It is the forerunner of the P-40. This is a P-36. It's a forerunner of the P-40, which is equipped with more firepower, bigger engine and all. The first one of this is the first one delivered to the 1st Air Force, and it was stationed in Africa, and you can see the desert design on the airplane, camouflage design, 1938. And these were built in the late 1930s, early 40s, and this was the first American fighter to engage the Japanese at Pearl Harbor. And we have just looked at the P-36, or the P-36, and now we're looking at the P-40. You can see the difference in the engine. Instead of a rotary engine, it has an inline engine with a big air intake. See the guns attached to the wings and the auxiliary fuel tank below. But these were the P-40s of World War II. It was a Hawker Hurricane, British airplane, built in the late 1930s. And when war broke out in Europe in 1938, by 1939, these airplanes were already in combat flying. There were better than 500 of these built. The British Hawker Hurricane. Cadet training airplane by a wing used in the middle 30s to train the air cadets, learning to be pilots. Model 19 cadet trainer. Again, it was used in the 30s to train cadets, Air Corps cadets. And the difference between it and this one was that's the bi-wing, and this is the first of the mono-wing. The PT-19s being pilot trainers, pursuit trainers. Trainer that was used during the Second World War. This came into existence in about 1940. Mono-wing, all-metal trainer, two-seater. Pilot and cadet and instructor could set in. 1,000 of these were ordered from various companies until the end of the World War II to train our pilots. Ryan PT-22 trainer. This is a link trainer that came into existence during World War II, and all Air Force cadets were required to finish a course in this link trainer. It had a desk there where a training officer could simulate different flight conditions, and the pilot had to react and fly that link trainer. They could even simulate crashes and various things, but the safety factor was that if they did crash, the cadet could walk away uninjured. Link trainer. Voltaire PT-13 Valiant. This was a late training airplane used. It was quite similar because it was much heavier, had a much more powerful engine, had a radio communications in it, it had a variable pitch propeller, all of which the pilots were required to use. These were used in the later flight training for the World War II pilot cadets. This is one of the last versions of the airplane before they started flying their actual combat missions as far as trainers. Over 10,000 of these were produced and used in training in the United States. Known as the Texan. And we'll walk up and take a look here in the cockpit in just a minute. 15,000 of these were used, and they were an advanced trainer. And a great many of them were used. Texan, North Americans' version of their trainer. And inside of the Texan, it's an AT-6A. 15,000 of this were delivered to the Air Force for advanced training. You see the radio antenna on the front. Here's a student in the front seat, and here's the instructor sitting in the back seat, giving instructions as to how to fly this airplane. Really quite simple by the cockpits of modern day airplanes. AT-11, known as a Kansan, is simply a beach two-motored aircraft modified with a plexiglass front. Of these, there were 45,000 bombardiers trained during the Second World War. 90% of them received their training flying in an airplane such as this. Here's what the Air Corps called the Piper L4 Grasshopper, better known as the Piper Cub J3. This is a military version. The only difference that I can see between it and the old J3s was not even evident. You can't even tell it. There's an emblem there on the side, but I think that's of the Air Rescue. Howard Putnam's dad had a J3 Piper Cub, and this was the first airplane that I ever took a ride in. The old J3 with the tail dragging wheel in the behind. In theater combat, displays of our military men in uniform, Royal Air Force service dress, many exhibits which we don't have time to take all of to the museum here. This is the European combat zone, and we'll take a shot of the Pacific in just a minute. Designates the area of the Pacific, showing China, Burma, Australia, Philippines, Borneo, all of the islands, and into Japan, which were fought in the Pacific theater. A lot of memorabilia and history here on the wall depicting the period of 41 through 45 in the Pacific Sea. The wing of an airplane behind that partition. It's actually the wing of a B-36, which we'll take a shot of here in a minute. This airplane was actually, the concrete was poured for the floor. The airplane was brought in here, and the hangar was constructed around this B-36. It's so large. Relics of the Third Reich, 1933, 1945, which Hitler said will last 1,000 years. One of the reasons, in fact, the reason, war in Europe, 1941-45. Of all the various airplanes that are housed here in the hangar, we're in the World War II section now. Actually, where aviation really began to emerge. Some of the airplanes suspended from the ceiling because they don't have room here to house them all. We'll try to catch as many of them as we can and give a brief description. This is the P-38. It was actually developed in 1938, but as the plaque says, it suffered growing pains until 1942 to be perfected. This airplane flew non-stop from Los Angeles to New York in 7 hours, a major feat in the late 1930s. By 1942, it had been placed into combat service in Europe. The Germans dubbed it the Twin-Tail Devil. Almost 10,000 of these were produced, used. P-38 Lightning. 39. Again, it was developed in 1938. It was first test flown here at Wright Field. By the time of the war, some 600 of these had been made. By the time the war was over, better than 9,500 of them had been produced. It's unusual. It's a first because see those exhaust ports right below the cockpit? It was a midship mounted engine, and I'll show you one here in just a minute with a little more close-up. And it allowed for more firepower through the propeller hook. This is the engine of the airplane. Massive engine. It had a long drive shaft with an offset propeller drive at the end. There above it, housed in the plastic housing, or the machine gun that was used in it. And again, this machine gun fired through the center of the propeller hub.
And so they just
B-39, two-engine airplane. Look at the size of that machine gun on that thing. B-25. 7 Thunderbolt. One of the better fighter planes of World War II. By the time the war was over, better than 15,000 of these P-47s had been built and placed into service. Fine airplane. 51 was flown. These entered the war somewhat later. In fact, it was late 1943. But again, almost 14,825 of these were built. They were used as fighter escorts, dive bombers, low-level bombers, just about anything in the European sector during World War II. They also flew fighter escorts for the B-29s as they flew bombing missions in the Pacific. These were used in the Korea conflict and were flown as late as 1957. These were powered by Rolls-Royce engines, and this was one of the best fighters to see service during World War II, the P-51 Mustang. Or Liberator, number 24, called the Strawberry Bitch. These were flown out of North Africa, many of them, and this is identical to the one that was lost, the Lady Be Good, which was lost over the Libyan desert in 1943 and was found in 1959. This is a 4-engine bomber, the famous B-24 Liberator. And some airplanes suspended from the ceilings in various colors. Observation of single-engine airplanes. There's one with the British markings on it. Unusual airplane sitting here before we get into some more bombers. This is a Messerschmitt 109G used by the Germans. Very fast, very sleek, very effective. And this airplane was flown by the German pilot who had the most hits during World War II. He downed over 300 airplanes, mostly Russian airplanes on the Russian front. This is a Messerschmitt 109. Very sleek, very fast, very effective airplane. Me-262. This is the first pure jet aircraft developed by the Germans. This airplane was actually developed in the late 1930s. In fact, in 1938, it was tested and retested. And finally, in the middle 1940s, this airplane was put into production. There were 1,400 of these produced but because of lack of pilots, because of lack of fuel, and because Hitler insisted that this airplane be used as a fighter and had to be modified as such. If these had been put into service, Germany might have had a very distinct advantage in air power, but only about 30 or 40 of these actually saw service. They would fly over 100 mile an hour faster than anything Americans had. There was one of these shot down, and it was shot down by General Yeager, the famous Air Force veteran. B-17 Flying Fortress. You can see the gunner and the bombardier in the front compartments there. The pilot had a gunner behind him. They found out this wasn't very effective. They tried to fly it. And of course, even with all the guns, with the faster pursuit airplanes of the Germans, they were easy targets. And it wasn't until they began to fly fighter protection that they really began to get these through and do their bombing runs. Many of them were lost because of the Germans shooting them down. Just a small observation type aircraft used by the Germans, another American executive type single engine transport. This is a shot of the turbojet engine. It's a Junkers Jumbo 004 used in these airplanes. You can see the radical design, the air intake, the fans, and the rear fans. I'm not sure exactly how that works, but it creates a terrible, the engine fires and creates this propulsion behind the jet airplane. B-17, we've got these groups of school kids coming through here now. I'm trying to avoid them. It shows the bomb trailer being loaded with bombs. Over here is another German airplane. It was their best fighter of World War II. Made its first flight on June 1939. It's called the Focke-Wulf FW-190D9. Maximum speed of 426, cruising speed of 280 mile an hour. A German aircraft fighter. It's Marauder. Flown in World War II. Plane is called the de Havilland DH-98 Mosquito, better known as a Mossy. Many of these were used in the early part of World War II. You can see the slots for the guns and the wings. You see the nose gunner, his position there. These were very fast airplanes. This was one of the best airplanes used in the early part of World War II. It was a British airplane, very effective, very fast. The famous Flying Super Fortress, World War II. A few of these were used in Europe, but many of them were used in the Pacific campaign. And of course, it was a model of the B-29 that dropped the famous bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in World War II. B-29, the boxcar. Probably the biggest airplane, biggest bomber to enter World War II. Known as a Moonlight Serenade, was built by Northrop Aircraft. It's the P-61, known as the Black Widow, and it was painted black, and this was the first airplane that was effectively used in nighttime bombing. In the nose was housed a radar unit. Of course, it had navigators, different crew members in this plastic housing. It was two-engine, but it was very effective. About 500 of these were actually built and saw service, known as the Black Widow, the P-61. The A-26 Invader. It was kind of an all-purpose airplane. Had guns on it. Could be used for low-level bombing. Could be used as low-level strafing, and even it was powerful enough that it was sometimes used as a pursuit aircraft to ward off incoming. This airplane, like I say, is the A-26. actually saw service as late as the Korean conflict. Up above are a series of helicopters. There's an early gyroscope. There's some of the early model helicopters that we saw. And we'll get some later shots of those. This boxcar. These airplanes were put into service in 1943 because of their size and everything. They did not use them in the European theater. They were used only in the Pacific theater. But this airplane dropped the second atomic bomb of World War II over Nagasaki. And so this is the actual airplane, one of the two that dropped the bomb. Truck, four-wheel drive, used during World War II. This one had seats in it where it could haul, it says 5 passengers, but I believe you could actually get 6 in there, 3 in front, 3 in back. New condition. This is a 1942 Ford staff car. You can see minus any chrome or anything on it. Simply a 1942 Ford used by the United States Air Force. Called the Little Girl. As you can see, the ports on the side there. There are 4 of them on this side and probably 4 on the other. Carry a pilot and several members in the Air Force. They were towed behind airplanes, and supposedly they were to glide behind the enemy line noiseless and land. Most of them cracked up, and many American lives were lost because of the ill design and the way they were operated. But this was a very dangerous and almost a death trap to many American GIs who were supposed to have landed behind enemy lines. The model of this was flown by General Billy Mitchell as he flew the first raids, the aircraft carriers over Japan in April of 1943. With a 75mm cannon. Stick your arm in that thing. It was a single shot mounted on this airplane, the largest cannon ever mounted on a World War II airplane. It was developed in late 1944. And it was one of their better airplanes, more effective, however, against the B-29s because of the altitude the B-29s could attain. The engine on this airplane simply could not operate at that altitude, and so they were ineffective against the B-29s. But this one was a good fighter, basically a sound airplane, had retractable gear, had cannons, was very good maneuverability of it. And we'll come around here, get a shot of the tail section. We can see the rising sun, emblem of the Japanese. This is one of the few Japanese planes that I see here in the museum. Our entry into the jet age, America. You saw the Messerschmitt with the 2 engines under the wing pods, but this is the Bell P-59B Aero Comet. This airplane was powered by a General Electric engine, which was an identical model to the English Whittle engine, who the English had developed prior to World War II. This airplane was personally ordered into production by General Hap Arnold and was first flown in 1943. Production of them was to begin, and some of them later models did see some action during World War II. But this is America's entry into the jet age, the Bell P-59 Aero Comet. Propeller-driven aircraft to come out of the Second World War. This is the North American F-82 Twin Mustang. These were developed to be escorts for the B-29s as they flew over Japan. And what it actually is two P-51 fighters together by single wing. They carried 2 pilots and of course a lot of fuel, and that was the object of them, was to be fighter escorts for these long-range bombers. These airplanes were not completed and put into service until 1946, and although they were some of the first airplanes flown over Korea during the Korean War, they remained in service until about 1957. And it was one of these airplanes that flew from Honolulu to New York non-stop, the longest flight of a propeller-driven airplane ever recorded in history. And the reason was that they had the two airplanes, the two pilots, one could rest while the other one flew, one could navigate while the other one did the actual piloting, but that was the object of it. So from this we probably leave the propeller-driven airplanes and we enter now into the pure jet era of the late 1940s and early 1950s. Shortly after World War II, they developed the jet aircraft. Some of them were quite sleek, very slow by today's standards, but they were sure an improvement over the older propeller-driven airplanes of World War II. This is a Lockheed T-33A Shooting Star, one of the first jet trainers that was used. It was a two-seater. It was used to train pilots, convert them from propeller-driven so that they might enter into the jet age in flying. And this was a trainer, one of the most famous trainers, most famous airplanes after World War II. They were put into service in 1948, and they trained thousands upon thousands of jet fighter pilots. Lockheed T-33. This would be the forerunner of the jet airplanes that were used in the late 1940s. This is known as a Lockheed P-80R Shooting Star. And the one that we just showed you, the Lockheed T-33, was also known as a Shooting Star. But this airplane was modified, and if you look at the canopy, instead of being a two-seater, it's been cut down to a one-seater. The canopy has been downsized to just that little bubble on top. All of the fuel tanks, everything that could create any drag or anything has been removed from this. And this airplane was flown in 1947 at something like 623 miles an hour. And this set a new world record for level flight of an aircraft, and returned that distinction to the United States after a 24-year absence. But this airplane was specifically designed for fast flight and fast flight only. And of the atomic bomb, little boy, that was dropped over Hiroshima on August the 6th of 1945. This bomb weighed about 9,000 pounds and was exploded at an altitude of about 1,800 feet over the city. But this is the little boy dropped on August the 6th. This is a replica of the Fat Man atomic bomb dropped over Nagasaki. This bomb was dropped 3 days later on August the 9th of 1945. There were two different types of bombs. They used two different types of nuclear fusions. I'm not sure the reason for it. Both of them were very, very devastating, although because of the terrain of Nagasaki being more hilly than Hiroshima, Nagasaki did not experience the level of devastation that Hiroshima did. These were the two atomic bombs, replicas, that were used on Japan in 1945. The airplane above us was a Japanese suicide bomb. It was called the Kushago. We called, our servicemen dubbed them as the Fool. There was a pilot in this contraption, and I'm looking into a bright light up there, so I'm probably not going to get a decent shot. But the pilot was in there. He was carried aloft by a mother airplane. He was released, and at a predetermined time, the pilot fired a rocket engine which propelled the airplane forward. The bomb was in the nose of the aircraft. They were used against our naval vessels in Okinawa in 1945, and they were quite successful. Needless to say, it was suicide because the pilot, of course, was blown to smithereens when the thing impacted. The note here says, contrary to what we had believed, the pilot was strapped in to this aircraft. It says that if they were not strapped in, the pilot, the Japanese, considered it an honor to die for the emperor. Suicide. I believe the World War I vintage airplanes of the Air Corps, the World War II in the late 1940s, and we're going to go now into what they call the Korean War exhibit, the air age of SAC. One thing I would like to say, many people, in fact most people, do not realize that there was no separate military branch as we know as the Air Force until 1948. Until that time, it was the United States Air Corps, which operated under a department of the United States Army. It operated that way from its inception in about 1909 until in 1948, in which it was established as a separate and distinctive military group. And it was now the Navy, Army, Marines, and Air Corps. It was no longer the United States Air Corps, part of the United States Army. So now we're going to enter into the SAC era, and the era of the Korean War of the early 1950s. Bring to your attention, and I showed you the wingspan of this, and that is of a B-36. And I want you to look at the size of this monstrosity. It was powered by 6 propeller engines with a twin jet or 4 jet engines located on each wing. You get some indication of the total size of the hangar that these airplanes are in. And all of the airplanes we have seen are housed in this hangar. And this B-36 sits in one end of it, and its wingspan reaches from one wall of the hangar to the other. To give you an example of just how large this airplane actually is. You see these airplanes, these jets parked under the wing, and that wing extends clear on to the other side of the building into the space age capsules. The plane was brought in, the hangar constructed around it. Now this is an F-80, Lockheed F-80 Shooting Star. These airplanes were actually developed during the Second World War. First flown in 1943, they were sent to Europe, but arrived there too late to enter into service in the actual combat during the Second World War. They were the mainstay of the Air Force during the early Korean conflict, and this F-80 Shooting Star was the first one to engage and shoot down to verify the shooting down of a MiG-15 over Korea. These airplanes were the first ones that would sustain flight of over 500 miles an hour and saw service from the 40s until the middle 50s in the Korean War. The F-80 Shooting Stars. Now as the F-102, the Delta Dagger was developed in 1953, put into production in 1956. Too late for the Korean War. It was a first in many respects. Radar controlled, had a radar control guidance system. It carried in its bomb bay 4 heat-seeking Falcon AIM missiles that could be fired. It also had some other 12-inch rockets that could be fired. This was one of the most advanced fighters of the 1950, the F-102. Quite an airplane, 600 mile an hour. This is just a landing wheel of the first XB-36, or the experimental B-36 landing gear. It was a single wheel. They had 2 of them. These things were 110 inches tall, 36 inches wide. They weighed 1,300 pounds a wheel, made by Goodyear. But because they put so much weight on the runways, very few runways could support such pressure. And so the landing gear was changed to a 4-wheel tandem type landing gear here, which would spread the weight of the aircraft more evenly over the concrete. Now as an F-100 Super Sabre, they were first developed in 1953, entered the service in 1957, and were the mainstay of the Air Force in the Vietnam conflict. The airplane could carry external bombs, as you see under the wing, external missiles, had an advanced guidance system, radar systems, and were capable of carrying thermonuclear bombs, which they did not deliver. This is an F-100 Super Sabre. Korean War or Vietnam vintage, 600 mile an hour. A Cessna YA-37A, kind of a unique little airplane. It was first developed in the 60s, and it did see action in Vietnam. It was kind of a jack of all trades, an experimental trainer, whatever you wanted to use, but they did mount cannons, rockets under it, external fuel tanks, carried bomb loads. It was used as a strafer, as a fighter, just about anything. Well, not as a fighter, I guess, but just kind of an auxiliary airplane. Kind of an ugly duckling with no other use than to do what the other airplanes wouldn't do. But this is one of them, used in Vietnam, and also later as a trainer. It is a Mark 17 thermonuclear bomb. It was developed in 1953 and was carried aboard the B-36s until 1957. As you can see, the thing was extremely large and heavy. This thing, when loaded, weighed 41,000 pounds. The early thermonuclear bomb. Many, many more times effective than the hydrogen bomb, or the atomic bomb. This was a hydrogen bomb. 41,000. The Korean and Vietnam area display of airplanes here. This propeller-driven airplane is here, and it's a Douglas A1E Skyraider. Because of its unique design, because it was so rugged, this airplane was deployed in Vietnam. You can see the racks underneath the wing on which it carried bombs. It was used as a low-level strafing airplane. It was used as a fighter plane. And the thing was just so doggone rugged that it was used in the Vietnam conflict with great success. One of the few propeller-driven airplanes employed. We show you that to show you the tail section of this B-36, how it extends almost all the way. Now we're going to look now at the engines, 6 propeller-driven engines, and here again the wing extends clear over to just within inches of the wall of this gigantic hangar. What a monster. The B-36. But it had to be to carry a 41,000 pound bomb. The plaque underneath it says that when the pilots would drop a Mach version of this bomb, that once it was released, that the airplane would actually just shoot up into the air several hundred feet just from the edge of the wing, forward edge of the wing. We come to the end of it, and we see that on the later model B-36s, they had twin jet engines mounted on a pod. They were just kind of like an afterthought, and this was only on the later models. And these jet engines would be used on takeoff to give it added speed and added lift at the time of takeoff, thus being able to use a shorter runway. They were not more famous of the Air Force's jet fighters. It was put into service in 1948. The thing flew better than 500 mile an hour with a top speed of something over the speed of sound. It was used in Korea. Almost 2,000 of these Sabre jets were built. 20 different nations of the world used these as their mainline fighters. And these Sabre jets shot down 761 MiG-15s over Korea, and we only lost 76 of these Sabre jets in dogfights, a win ratio of 76 to 1. But that's the F-86 Sabre jet. Next to it, we're looking now, and we'll fade out, 15. And those of us that remember a little of Korea, these were the Russian-built airplanes that the North Koreans were flying, even flying by some Chinese and some Russian pilots. And you can see the difference in the size of the MiG-15 compared to the F-86 Sabre jet. And compared to a B-36, you can put it in the cockpit almost. MiG-15, Beech-19B helicopter. It was developed in the 50s, used in the 50s and 60s. It was unique in the fact that the engine was mounted in front of the cockpit, allowing the belly. Come here to a Republic F-84 Thunderjet. These were developed and put into service in 1947. And if you follow these through, the F series now means fighter. We had the F-84s, the F-86s, the F-100s, F-101s, and right on down the line. But this was an F-84 Thunderjet. It was used extensively in Korea, not so much as a fighter, but as a low-level bomber and strafer, where they would go in and low-level drop armaments. Under the wing of this F-84 is a Mark 7 nuclear bomb. And you can see the difference now that has transpired in a few years between that first nuclear bomb carried by the B-36s to the smaller Mark 7s that are under the wing here. The largest camera. And it shows the film there that's on board this camera. It'll make it's 18 inches wide, and there's 500 foot in a full spool of film there. It will take a negative that's 18 by 36 inches. Pardon me, 18 by 48 inches. This camera, developed by Boston University in 1951, was placed aboard the B-36RBs, which is a reconnaissance plane. It was used for reconnaissance flights. And you can see the cutaway there. I hope the lighting doesn't get in the way. But that's the camera. And it is said that it could take a picture of a golf ball at 45,000 feet. World's largest, an F-94 Starfire, which was a later development of the Shooting Star, one of the 1940s model, 46 model jets. This one is an all-weather plane with a radar unit in the nose, the added range of the wing tanks, but it could be flown in all weather and had advanced guidance systems. But this is the F-94 Starfire, produced in the early 1900s. We're looking now at an F-84F Thunderball. This is a F-Series F-84. One of the differences was that this was developed in the 50s, a modification of the F-84. It has swept wings, more powerful engine, and of course can carry a larger payload, faster, and at a greatly increased range. The F-8, we have to take a bus ride across from the main museum. There are some airplanes here that I wanted to see while I'm here, and today it's not raining. We're looking now at it's a Beech airplane. It was known as the Beech 18, known as the CH-45H in the Air Force. This is a later model airplane. They were built in the 40s, and in the late 50s they were completely restored. And it was just a light passenger airplane, but they had to take command personnel or somebody to a small airport. They would use these twin-engine airplanes to deliver passenger and light cargo. They saw passenger service in some areas even as late as the 1940s, 1950s. An airplane. It was a North American single-engine, four-seat, four-passenger airplane, just used to ferry people and light cargo around. Completely restored. These were built into the 1960s. Now, at the nose and part of the engine section of an airplane, you can see the name on it. It says the Independence. This was the first Air Force One that was put into service. And this airplane was used by President Truman. And it was christened, of course, the Independence. It had a range of about 4,000 miles, cruised at something like 300 miles an hour. But this was the Independence, Harry Truman's private airplane named Air Force One. You can go up the steps and go through the airplane. I don't know whether we can take many pictures or not in it because of the plexiglass, but we'll go through it. Sitting next to it is a Constellation, Lockheed Constellation. This is a DC-6 made by Douglas. And Dwight Eisenhower, when he took the presidency, had a Constellation converted, which was known as Air Force One, christened the Columbine. But this is the Independence, Air Force One, Harry Truman's airplane while he was president of the United States. The nose section, and we'll zoom in here, I don't know if you can see it or not, it's got a flower on it, it's called the Columbine. It was christened by Mamie Eisenhower because it was the state flower, the Columbine, of her native Colorado. And this was the Lockheed Constellation that Dwight Eisenhower used as Air Force One. This is all plexiglassed in, but there's a mannequin of Harry Truman sitting here at his desk in Air Force One. At the end of the airplane was known as the presidential dressing room and his laboratory. Here clear to the when we were in here, we're in the annex now where President Truman's Air Force One, President Eisenhower's Constellation, that served him as Air Force One, and which there is a commercial jet here in which Presidents Nixon's, Ford, Carter, and Reagan had flown in. And it's not the 707 which you normally associate with Air Force One, but a smaller private version, and we'll show you. But we ran out of battery yesterday, and we're looking at President Truman's airplane that he used when he first took office. They had a C-54, which is a DC-4, called a Sacred Cow, that President Roosevelt used. But President Truman commissioned this airplane, a DC-6, pressurized cabin, had a capacity of 24 that could travel with him, had sleeping bunks that could sleep 12. And so we'll move on now to Eisenhower's Constellation. The nose of the Constellation that President Eisenhower used when he was in office. Strange thing is, it's a little larger airplane. It has a range of 4,000 miles, but it isn't nearly as fast as was the DC-6 in which it replaced. DC-6 cruised at like 320 miles an hour. This one's top speed, cruising speed, was 260. But just a little different type airplane. Section now, this Constellation, instead of just having one rudder in the elevator, it had the vertical fins on it. So it had 3 vertical fins on the tail. This was one way you could tell a Constellation above all else. Plus the fact that it looked like it's set on stilts. That's the rear dressing room and laboratory. Mannequin of President Eisenhower here aboard his airplane. Telephones at his fingertips. Insulated cupboards, sink, coffee pot, even have a range here, electric range, and 2 toasters. The Lockheed Constellation, Air Force One, during the Eisenhower years. Jet Star. This is my idea of a neat airplane. And if you see along the side it says United States of America. There were several of these purchased by the government. 16 of them were used for command airplanes when various dignitaries were flying. And this plane was kept at Andrews Air Force Base, and it was actually used on short trips by Presidents Nixon, President Ford, President Carter, and President Reagan. It was last flown in 1987 when it was brought here to the museum. This was not the 707, which was the official Air Force One, but when this plane was in the air carrying the president, it went under the radio call signals of Air Force One. Bell Model Sioux helicopter. There were two of these purchased by the United States government. They were kept in the Washington, D.C. area, and President Eisenhower was the first president to fly in a helicopter from the White House lawn. And he flew on the sister ship. There were two of these that were modified and kept in the Washington area to fly the president and dignitaries around, and it was a sister ship identical to this one that President Eisenhower made the first helicopter flight by a president from the White House lawn. That was in 1950. Now is a North American T-39A Sabreliner, developed in the 1960s. There were about 140 of these purchased by the Air Force. This particular airplane, after being assigned to a tour of duty in Europe, brought home after a minor crash, completely restored, was sent to Bergstrom Air Force Base in Texas. There it was used by President Lyndon Johnson when he would be home from duties in Washington to his Texas ranch. He sometimes flew on this particular airplane. That's a North American Sabreliner. At the Independence, President Truman's private DC-6. A far better airplane than Eisenhower's front of the Constellation, Columbine, President Eisenhower's Air Force One. It's a sign. This is a Hawker Siddeley XV-6A Kestrel. The British-built Kestrel was designed with a V-stall vertical short takeoff and landing capabilities, making it possible to operate from grass or semi-prepared surfaces, which offered great operational flexibility. 4 adjustable exhaust nozzles beneath the wing roots could be rotated to provide thrust for vertical, backward, or hovering flight, as well as conventional forward movement. The first Kestrel began conventional flight trials on March 13, 1961 in Britain. In 1962, the governments of the U.S., Britain, and the Federal Republic of Germany ordered 9 aircraft for combined testing. They formed an evaluation squadron which conducted Kestrel trials between April and September 1965. 6 of these trial aircraft were delivered later to the United States, where, as XV-6As, they underwent additional testing of V-stall fighter techniques. An improved version known as the Harrier became the world's first operational V-stall fighter when it entered Royal Air Force service in 1969. When this aircraft was delivered to the museum in 1970 from Edwards Air Force Base, California, it became the first airplane to be airlifted by the giant C-54A. And we'll get some footage of this. Notice the very short wings with the outboard landing gear on it. Those wings are just swept back and they're very short, not over probably 10 foot long. Here are the exhaust ports, which can be maneuvered, moved for either forward, vertical, or backwards flight. And there, of course, is the air intake and the cockpit. This is much like the Harrier airplane that we've seen flying off the carriers and used in the Desert Storm exercise. Fire trucks that were used. And that is a Chance Vought XC-142A. It was an experimental airplane. There were 5 of these built, and this is the only one remaining. It was used by the United States Air Force and also by NASA to test the feasibility of the V-stall type airplane. The regular airplane, these wings would actually tilt up. The propellers were all synchronized, so they all turned at the same speed. It had a tail rotor on it that we'll come back here and see. It had a tail rotor. And you've seen pictures of these in test. They were never very feasible, and of the 5 built, this is the only one that remains. These were a 1960s version. They're large aircraft, could deploy a number of troops. Let's say you would fly at 400 mile an hour forward, and they could fly as fast as 35 miles an hour backwards. A test airplane. At a Lockheed FY-12A. This is a prototype of an airplane that was developed. It was actually flown on several occasions, and it's the forerunner of what we know as the SR-71 Blackbird. In fact, as you look at this airplane, your first impression is that's what it is one of the highly secret SR-71 Blackbirds, but it is not. It's the forerunner, a prototype. And this airplane was flown, it was unveiled from secrecy in the early 1960s, 1964, and in 1967 this airplane flew with a manned crew, just a one-man manned crew, at 2,071 miles an hour at an altitude of 80,000 feet. This is one that the spy planes, they were not used for reconnaissance, aerial photography, spying between these and the U-2, and I haven't found a U-2 on display yet, but these were the highly secret planes, and the SR-71 is still in service today, being used, but this airplane is a Mach 3 airplane, flying better than 2,000 miles an hour. To the side of it is just a radar-controlled drone that the Air Force has used to test the designs of rockets and various components of aircraft. It's radio-controlled, requires no pilot. This dude here, the forerunner of the SR-71, made of 93% titanium with a special black paint on it which radiates heat away from the skin of the airplane because the friction on the airplane on the outside reaches 500 degrees at these sustained speeds of 2,000 miles an hour. We're just looking now at some other aircrafts. These are just versions. The one we're looking at here is a version of the F-84 with the catch on the front. It was actually carried under the belly of a B-52. It was going to be carried and released so it could supply fighter power. We're looking at Truman's airplane, the little private jet used by Presidents Nixon, Ford, Carter, and Reagan. And here is a North American F-107A, which was designed, but it never did. Notice the unusual air scoop above the cockpit. Never did. We've got two other airplanes here we'll look at, and we'll move on. Here are a few airplanes, but this one in particular is my kind of an airplane. This is a Ryan STA. It was built in 1939. And this airplane was a private-owned airplane by the Ryan Aircraft Corporation. This one was never owned by the Air Force, although it was used in demonstrations in 1939, and the government did order several of these for trainers. But as you look at it, you'll find that it has a fabric wing, has an aluminum fuselage and landing struts, has an open cockpit, two-seater with fabric wings, and has wires and braces stressed to the metal of the fuselage. That's my idea of flying. It is a Beechcraft designated as a VC-6A. This is the only one of this particular type aircraft ever purchased by the United States Air Force. We know them in commercial aviation as a Beechcraft King Air. It's a twin-engine turboprop. This is a 10-passenger. It's been pressurized, has an executive cabin in it, and it's known as the Lady Bird Special. And again, this is one of the airplanes that was stationed at Bergstrom Air Force Base in Texas. And President Lyndon Johnson and Lady Bird actually used this airplane to fly from the air base to their ranch in Johnson City, Texas. Beechcraft King Air, known as the Lady Bird Special. Lady Bird Special. Another neat airplane. This placard here in front of this airplane, this is a Lockheed AC-130A Hercules. The plaque reads, the C-130 was originally designed as an assault transport capable of operating from unpaved, hastily prepared airstrips. On August 23, 1954, the Hercules made its first flight, and by 1976, more than 1,200 C-130s had been ordered, including ones equipped for radar, weather mapping, and reconnaissance. Mid-air space capsule recovery, search and rescue, ambulance service, drone launching, and mid-air refueling of helicopters. The C-130 could transport up to 92 combat troops with their gear or 45,000 pounds of cargo. Where facilities were inadequate, the Hercules could deliver its cargo by parachute or by low-altitude ground cable extraction without landing. 28 C-130s were converted to side-firing gunships, primarily for night attacks against ground targets. The AC-130A on display was modified at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base as a prototype for the gunship version and was initially equipped with 4 20mm and 4 7.62mm multi-barrel guns, a searchlight, and a target sensors. After testing in Southeast Asia in 1967, it was used as a test bed for additional armament sensors, fire control development. Later AC-130 gunships mounted improved sensors, a digital fire control computer, and heavier armament. And this aircraft was retired to the museum in May in 1976. And this dude has a wingspan of 132 feet 7 inches. It's 97 feet 10 inches long. It's 38 feet 6 inches tall. It weighs 124,200 pounds when loaded. The armament of this one is 2 7.62mm miniguns plus 2 20mm, 2 40mm, and 105mm cannon. Maximum speed is 380. Cruising speed is 335, range is 2,500 statute miles, and service ceiling is 32,000 feet. Cost $5,240,000. There she is, the old Hercules 130. And we'll go around to the other side, and you can see the armament on this dude. Flying Dragon, or whatever they call them. Left side of this 130, C-130. I don't know what these bubbles are. There's something for sensors or lights, but there are the guns. Those evidently are the 20mm guns. These apparently are the 6.62mm guns that are here. There are 2 more guns to the rear. And I'm not sure what caliber them dudes are. Probably 50mm. But then here on the floor is a cannon that's mounted. There's one of the shells. This is a 105mm howitzer. And they actually mounted this dude in the doorway of the C-130s. This plane was actually the test plane that was developed, and it was developed here at Wright-Patterson. This particular gun, cannon, the 105, was never on this ship, but it was used on these Hercules 130s over Vietnam. The DC-3s that were equipped with Gatling guns as a trainer, but during Vietnam, it was converted into a fighter bomber and was called the Nomad. And this is one of the few propeller-driven pre-jet aircraft that was used, but they were very effective. We're in the added wing of the Air Force Museum here, and this has some later flights, and then we'll go through the space capsules and then the exhibits outside. We're looking here at a North American A-36A, which was a dive bomber. It was a converted from a Mustang fighter plane to a dive bomber, and you can see the little grill here on the wings, and that is a brake. And as they would dive, because of the tremendous force going down, they would use these brakes to give added stability to the wings. This is an A-36A. Yeah. Has the markings of 2 swastikas here on the near the propeller, and I'm not sure what that is, whether that means that it, as a fighter dive bomber, it is shot down 2 German planes or not. 36 that we were looking at here, the dive bomber. We're just going to pan through here in this new hangar, and of course you can see that where in the other hangar the B-36 was the main attraction. Here it is the B-52. And of course we've heard a lot about the B-52s. Here in the foreground is some of the armament that was used in the display from the Desert Storm. And we'll continue on. Known as the Bolo. They were a later version of the B-10 that we saw earlier that was painted blue and white, blue and yellow rather. And many of these too were destroyed at Pearl Harbor. In 1936, the Air Force conducted trials here at Wright-Patterson, and they chose the B-18 Douglas version of the B-10 over the Martin entry, and over one by Boeing, which would later become the B-17. These were obsolete even from the day they were bought because of the B-17 was such a superior airplane. Continue on for a minute here. The reason these were selected in 1936, we were in the midst of a depression, and because of the tight Air Force budget, these were so much less expensive than the B-17s that the Air Force chose this one on a cost factor. Or the DC-3, the old Goonie birds. This plane was actually developed in 1936, and some of them are still flying today. I flew one of them in commercial service many years ago when I worked for Capital Airlines. DC-3. I'm familiar with this as the original Willis Overland Jeep. 639,000 of these were built for the military during World War II. The half-ton all-purpose, or the quarter-ton rather, all-purpose Jeep. Military used. As you look at it, its twin engine looks similar to the DC-3. It is larger, would hold more cargo. The problem was that it was mechanically was not as dependable as the old DC-3, and this is the airplane that the Flying Tigers used as they flew the hump from Burma and into India. And above it, Sky King, where are you? And this is what it is, one of the airplanes. The Air Force had a few of these, and this was used by Sky King in his TV series in the 1950s. Sky King airplane, it's a Cessna Bobcat known as a UC-78, and many of these, several hundred of these, were purchased by the Air Force and used for command transports, called the Bamboo Bomber by those who flew them. We had a 1930 model rescue plane. It's the Grumman OA-12, known as the Duck, an amphibious rescue. Now we're looking at a helicopter used in the Korean War. If you've watched MASH, you've probably seen these used for rescue. They could carry 2-liter patients on the size, and it's known as a whatever, Sikorsky YH-5A. Now I'm going to turn around here again because I misidentified this airplane. I said I think it was a C-48. That's incorrect. This is actually a C-46. C-46, bigger than the DC-3, but they had maintenance problems and they were very expensive to run because they were gas guzzlers, but they were used to fly the hump. Developed in the 1950s, used extensively in Vietnam. Let's redo this one. This is known as the Consolidated OA-10A Catalina. Had the wing above it, they call it the parasol wing. It was used for rescue, called the Snafu Snatcher. If you snafooed and landed in the ocean, they went out and tried to rescue you in an airplane. This one has a gun turret mounted on the front. They did have armament on them, but this is not the correct turret. And they said that when one became available, they would replace this one. A 16 Albatross amphibious airplane. The display shows a airman suspended on a platform working on the engine. This is a late 1940s model with the radar cone in it, or the WC field nose, another amphibious. Shot of this one, but this is a Douglas O-46A observation plane. The reason I did it, the thing is so awkward, and it has a enclosed cockpit behind the wing for the observers in the airplane. It has a glass shield under the wing I don't know what that's for, but you can look at that thing, and a cruising speed of 171. It was finally retired in the early part of World War II. It was just too slow and too uneasy of a target for an enemy aircraft to shoot down. And several of these were destroyed at Clark Field in the Philippines by the Japanese in World War II. Looking at here is a very stub-nosed twin-engine airplane known as the Curtiss AT-9 Jeep. And this is the one that was used to train multi-engine pilots that use twin-engine aircraft. The Jeep. An A-20 built by Douglas. Over 7,000 of these were built during the Second World War. It was used as an attack bomber, an A-20. A North American B-45 Tornado. This airplane design was actually developed during the Second World War. It was developed and tested in 1947 and became our first operational 4-engine jet-powered bomber. In the early 50s, it was the first multi-engine bomber to fly non-stop across the Pacific. It flew from Alaska to Japan, was refueled en route, and made the flight in something under 10 hours, 9 hours and 50 minutes. B-45, late 40s version. C-124, 4-engine cargo plane known as Old Shaky. These planes, believe it or not, were first flown in 1949. They were retired from active service in 1974, but many National Guard units still fly these airplanes called Old Shaky. They were replaced by the 130s and later model cargo planes. But this was the first cargo plane with the open door where they could drive jeeps, tanks, whatever, into it. They could carry over 100 combat-ready men, and they could even parachute from this thing, a C-124. Later version of the famous F-86 Sabre jet, flown in the 50s, an first all-weather interceptor, carried the first rockets on it. It was the first one-man plane, fighter plane, where the pilot controlled the navigation, the armament, and flying of the airplane. This airplane actually flew better than 715 miles an hour in 1953. This was our first line interceptor during the early 1950s and in Korea. It has a very long, very wide wing area. It has a 3-blade propeller. It's called a Super Courier, and it was developed in the late 1950s. 3 of these were ordered by the Air Force for evaluation. They were an observation airplane, and they were STOL, short takeoff and landing type aircrafts. They could utilize a strip of 100 yards, no longer than a football field, for takeoff and landing. And this airplane had a stall speed of somewhere between 25 and 35 miles an hour. And so they could really fly this thing just almost at a standstill, 25 miles an hour, and still maintain flight. They're just another 2-engine airplane suspended from the ceiling. But here we are looking in the background at the B-52, and we'll get another view of this in a minute. With the B-52, we've certainly heard quite a lot about it in the past few months. Developed in the 50s, SAC flew them. Still one of the mainstays of our defense system. There's a B-1A sitting out here on the pad. We'll get some shots of that before we leave, but this is the B-52. Is an F-100D Super Sabre. This is a later version of the F-100, which was developed in the mid-50s, was used extensively in Vietnam. It's the first fighter interceptor that we had that was capable of faster than speed flight at normal flight. This airplane is painted in red, white, and blue. Perhaps if you saw the Thunderbirds either perform or on television in the mid-1960s, this was the aircraft that was used by in fact, this is one of the aircraft used by the Thunderbirds in the 1960s. 52 is known as a Northrop YF-5A Freedom Fighter. And this was just simply a jet trainer used by the pilots. If you can see the wing pod there, how short the wings are on that airplane, the needle nose. Over 2,000 of these have been used and deployed throughout the world to train pilots to fly jet aircraft, the Freedom Fighter. This aircraft is a B-52D SN 56-665. It says there are approximately 156 holes causing extensive damage to skin structure at the following locations: fuselage, left and right wings, left aft wheel door, nose, radome, vertical stabilizer, left and right horizontal stabilizers, and left and right drop tanks. This thing was shot up during the Vietnam War, and it says number 1 and number 3 engines will require replacement. Aircraft hours 9,690. This thing was actually shot at 156 times and yet made it back into base. It's the Boeing B-52D Stratofortress. A big bird. Here, landing gear on it consists of tandem wheels here on the rear, 2 tandem wheels of 4. The front has the same under the fuselage. And then as we pan over this dude, you see the engine pods, and you can see the landing gear wheel at the end of the wing. Some of the tents that are used erected very quickly on combat sites. We'll go through some of those. Bunkhouse, living quarters for servicemen with their cots, constructed of 2x4s, plywood, floor, and canvas covering. With your sign underneath it says breakfast 05:30 to 07, dinner 11 to 12:30, supper 4:30 to 6. It says if you want to eat, be here on time. And shows the cook inside, screened in with the mesh. 7106 Delta Dart. This airplane has an unusual history behind it. In February of 1970, this airplane was being flown out of Malmstrom Air Force Base. The airplane, for some reason, went out of control. The pilot was not able to control the aircraft, and so he ejected. After he had ejected from the airplane, because evidently of the weight change or whatever it was, the airplane regained flying status, coasted to a landing on a snow-covered field. There was only minor damage to the aircraft. It's been repaired, it's flyable, and here it is in the Air Force Museum. And here are some pictures, if we can zoom in, of the aircraft laying on this snow-covered field, virtually undamaged. I'm not familiar with, this is one of them. This is the B-66, or the RB-66, Reconnaissance and Bombing is what it stood for. It was a 2-engine bomber. It was first tested in the late 50s, went into production. Only some 15 of these were ever produced, and it was the last tactical bomber and reconnaissance plane that was ever made. Some of these were modified and used as reconnaissance in Vietnam during the conflict there. B-66. The nose section of a B-47. Here again it has the tricycle landing gear, give you some idea of the difference between the size of the B-47 and the B-52. This airplane, B-47, was actually flown in December of 1947. 1,200 of these were built and used by SAC, and they were finally retired in the late 60s. It's a very advanced airplane. It's the first swept-wing jet aircraft that was developed by the Air Force. It is also the first airplane to use the principle of fly-by-wire. Instead of using cables from the control of the rudders and the wheel of the airplane, it was done by electrical systems, electrical motors, which move the various components, the elevators, ailerons, and various things of the airplane. B-47, 1,200 of them used from 1950s until they went out of service in 1969, replaced by the larger B-52s in SAC. A later version of the airplane. Of course, this was came into prominence in about 1960. This airplane was actually, it's a twin jet airplane, jet engines on both sides, flew at an altitude above 55,000 feet. It first went into operation in 1955 and was kept secret until 1960 when Gary Powers was shot down in a U-2 over Russia. But this is the U-2 reconnaissance airplane flown by our military. Filming of the museum here, we filmed a MiG-15 which was used in Korea. Now we're looking here at a MiG-21. This airplane is actually a North Vietnamese airplane which was somehow acquired by a private individual. The placard here about the MiG-15, and I'll not read it, states that these airplanes were flown by at least 30 different nations. They're a fairly low-cost airplane. They're not particularly effective, but they were flown. Some of them were friendly to the United States. But during Vietnam, over 65 of these were shot down by our F-86s, F-100s, and even by B-52s. But this is the MiG-21, the Russian version of the fighter plane. The way this display is set up, this airplane we're looking at here is a MiG-17. This is a later version of the MiG-15, which was flown primarily in the Korean War. Its wingspan is longer, the fuselage is 3 foot longer, and it has an afterburner. It's a superior airplane to the MiG-15. This is the MiG-17. These were put into service after Korea, but many of them were shot down, the MiG-17s and the MiG-21s over Vietnam. And again, several thousand of these have been produced, and at least 20 nations have bought them from the Russians. We're going to look now at some very unusual airplanes, and we'll continue our tour. Shoot the tail section of a B-52. I wasn't aware that there was a canopy and rear guns on a B-52 bomber, but evidently there are on some of them. Rear armament for the B-52s. Too close to the U-2 a minute ago, but there is a picture. I hope the lights don't interfere, but the suspended U-2 here in the museum. It's a U-2A. We're looking now at a B-58 bomber called the Hustler. About 150 of these were actually acquired and were flown by SAC. It's a 4-engine delta wing bomber with a pod on the rear, and I don't know what all was housed in that pod, evidently fuel. This plane in the early 1960s set speed records flying from Los Angeles to New York and return. But the plane was flown from 1960 and retired from the Air Force in 1970. Here's another neat little twin-engine private aircraft of some kind that we use. Now we're going to look at some unusual. This is the SR-71, and this is a very unusual plane here. I don't know whether we can get it all in or not, but we'll tell you a little bit more about it. Only 2 of these were ever made, ever built. And this is one here, and the SR-71 Blackbird here in the rear. The SR-71. Well, I better go back and read that plaque because I don't think I had the camera on when I read it. The plaque reads here, the Lockheed SR-71A. The SR-71, unofficially known as a Blackbird, is a long-range advanced strategic reconnaissance aircraft developed from Lockheed A-12 and YF-12A aircraft. And there was a YF-12A over in the annex that we took the picture of. The first flight of the SR-71 took place on December 22nd, 1964, and the first SR-71 to enter service was delivered to the 420th, later the 9th Strategic Reconnaissance Wing at Beale Air Force Base, California in January of 1966. The U.S. Air Force retired its fleet of SR-71s on January 26, 1990 because of decreasing defense budget and high cost of operation. Throughout its nearly 24-year career, the SR-71 remained the world's fastest and highest flying operational aircraft. From 80,000 feet, it could survey 100,000 square miles of Earth's surface per hour. On July 28, 1976, the SR-71 set 2 world records for its class: an absolute speed of 2,193.167 miles per hour and at an absolute altitude of 85,068 feet, 0.997 feet. SR-71 Blackbird. Whether I had the camera on or not when I read this, North American XB-70 Valkyrie. The XB-70, one of the world's most exotic airplanes, was conceived for the Strategic Air Command in the 1950s as a high-altitude bomber that could fly 3 times the speed of sound, Mach 3. Because of fund limitations, only 2 were built, not as bombers but as research aircraft for the advanced study of aerodynamics, propulsion, and other subjects related to large supersonic aircraft. The Valkyrie was built largely of stainless steel honeycomb sandwich panels and titanium. It was designed to make use of a phenomenon known as compression lift, achieved when the shock wave generated by the airplane flying at supersonic speeds supports part of the airplane's weight. For improved stability at supersonic speeds, the Valkyrie could droop its wingtips as much as 65 degrees. The number 1 XB-70 made its initial flight on September 21, 1964. First achieved Mach 3 flight on October 14, 1965. Number 2 aircraft first flew on July 17, 1965, but on June 8, 1966 it crashed following a mid-air collision. The number 1 airplane continued in its research program until flown to the museum on February 4, 1969. I've got some earlier pictures. This thing, when this portion of the museum was completed a couple of years ago, it was brought inside. Until that time it had sat outside over by the annex. That's the XB-70. One gigantic airplane, one of 2 made, the first one produced. This is the XB-1B, X-1B Bell rocket plane. Used in the early 1950s, was carried to about 45,000 feet by the mothership, released, and this tested some problems of supersonic speed. X-124B, and this is nothing but a module. It's wingless, was carried aloft by a B-52, released at about 45,000 feet to test how a wingless airplane could fly, later used in our astronaut program. But the Martin X-24B successfully landed. And you can see it's called the Douglas X-3 Stiletto. And you can certainly see why with that long nose. It's really quite a sophisticated airplane. But it was carried aloft in 1952, released to study the effects of supersonic flight on a rocket airplane. It was used to help develop the F-104, the X-15, and the SR-71s. And this was just an experimental airplane. I think Chuck Yeager made it famous in 1959 by flying it. It was released from a B-52, soared to over 50 miles above the atmosphere at a speed of 4,500 miles an hour, the X-15. That's a Mach 7 speed at 4,500 miles per hour. And 3 of these were built. The original one is in the Smithsonian. This is number 2, and number 3 was destroyed in a crash, the X-15. Very quickly, this is a McDonnell RF-101 Voodoo. See the missiles on it, the bombs under the rack here, and we'll get a description of it in just a minute. Remember, we were looking at the bombs and the missiles on board this one. This is an F-4, known as a Phantom II, the Wild Weasel. Many of these were flown again in Saudi Arabia in the last war. Desert Storm. A-7D, with its bombs under its wings, one-man airplane. The Navy flies many of these as a Corsair 2s. Again, they were flown off of the battleships in Desert Storm. First came into service in 1960, display or not. But in here is a model of a C-47 or a DC-3. It's called Spooky. They were known as dragon wagons, and remember the DC-3, they had taken the windows out, they had taken the door out and had mounted cannons into these things. And these guns, these planes were used in Vietnam for low-level strafing. The old DC-3s converted to a battle wagon or Sea Starfighter. And many of these were used, carried missiles. These airplanes actually set an altitude record of over 103,000 feet. The F-104s. American T-28 Trojan trainer. This plane was actually modified into a reconnaissance fighter and was used in Vietnam. This airplane is known as the T-33A Mentor, and if you look at it, you can see that it's nothing more than a modified beach aircraft, one passenger aircraft, but it was used as a primary trainer in the 50s.
It looks like an eyeball, a rotating eyeball on the front. That's the laser guidance system on there. Now that tracks to a target that has been pinpointed by the laser. Well, the equipment for pinpoint, that has the laser in it is this right here. It's there are several types of these. As this here, the laser is in the nose, and that pinpoints the target, and that eye follows down to it. Now we don't use this one here very much, paved spike, because it only works in the daylight. Today we use what's called a lantern system, which is the same type of thing, but the lantern system works extremely well at night, in fog or in anything else. It doesn't really, it's not inhibited by other conditions. I thought you might like to see, get some idea of how, what type of smart bomb it is.
Another laser guided bomb here. Smart bombs, if you want to call them that. I'm just going to walk around here. These were all used in Desert Storm. I guess that had a parachute on it to guide it down. Here is a unique thing. It's an ECM pod, electronics countermeasure, designed to provide aircraft self-protection against radar threats. The ALQ-131 accomplishes this by responding with a combination of noise, repeater, or transponder electronic jamming systems. Pod weighs 600 pounds with modular, designed for multi-frequency band capability. It has the ability to be quickly reprogrammed against changing threats. The ALQ-31 was used by A-10s, F-16s, F-11. Other ECM systems being used by U.S. aircraft include the ALQ-119 and the ALQ-184. Here's another guided bomb with no system. Many of them carried aboard the B-52. Loaded to capacity, that thing could probably destroy most of the civilized world in one fell sweep by bombing the civilized countries of the world. Supersonic air-to-air missile carried by A-10s, F-4s, F-15s, F-16s, and F-11 aircraft. Here's the AIM-7 Sparrow, 500-pound supersonic air-to-air missile carried by F-4s and F-15, radar guided and can destroy targets 10 miles away. Here's an AIM-65 highly accurate 465-pound air-to-ground missile employed by A-10s and F-16 aircraft. And here's a GBU-10 laser guided bomb. It's a 2,000-pound bomb fitted with a laser seeker and mechanical control surface. The bomb shown here is a second generation Paveway 2 variant. These bombs and further improvement Paveway 3 series are being used on F-15s, F-111s, and F-117 aircraft in Desert Storm. This weapon is used against targets requiring precise impact and highly explosive force, such as bridges and hardened aircraft shelters. That's the one that they could put in a window. Some of the aircraft. This is a recently completed building here. It's only been in existence about 3 years. Many of these aircraft were outside. The C-124, B-52, the U-2, the B-58 Hustler. area of the museum. Many things here that I don't understand, but we'll move through it very quickly. Some of the capsules were actually used in some of the space missions that our country has undertaken. Here is a Rocketdyne S-3D liquid rocket engine. And this is one of the first rocket engines that propelled spacecraft. And they would develop 150,000 pounds of thrust for approximately 2.5 minutes. And here again is a rocket engine, or a smaller engine. Here is another solid rocket motor, closed in just a capsule like that. And we'll continue on. Another Aerojet General LR-87 liquid rocket engines. Here's a Lockheed Agenda A space vehicle, showing some of the placards that we have here. The father of modern rocketry, Dr. Robert H. Goddard. The German V-2 rocket there on the plaque, and I'm not sure that I can do any good with the reflection of the lights here. Here is another rocket engine. This is the XLR-99 rocket engine, and you can see some of the components of it. Here's the auxiliary power unit for the Dyna Solar. Various lifting bodies, nose cones, and various rockets. 24 we looked at a while ago over there was carried above 45,000 feet and released in a B-52. It was to test the flight of wingless aircraft as they re-entered the Earth. And you see them making their landings there. More this is a Northrop OV-25 space satellite mock-up of a rocketry space capsule used from 1961 to 63, actually flown by our astronauts. Spacecraft actually flown and used in 1964. The Mercuries were first used in 61 to 63. The Gemini was flown in 1964. It says, in the years since 1957, when mankind entered the space age, technical innovations from the space program have been finding their way to consumers at an ever-increasing pace. We're going to show you some of these that they have here on the boards. Up above, you can see a cordless electric screwdriver. We see an cordless electric drill. We see a cordless vacuum cleaner. We see artificial hip joints. I don't know how they came out of the space program, but I guess the materials used in them. We see solar-powered calculators, emergency locators, and transmitter beacons. We see graphite composite fishing rods, and even WD-40. We see the Cellular One telephones, heat-resistant goods, packaged towelettes, Tang breakfast foods. We see packaged foods of various kinds. We find the space pen. We find the computer compact disc. We find Teflon tapes used to seal pipe joints and plumbing. Solar cells, Velcro, and computer chips were all spin-offs of the space program, and many, many more. Because of the light reflection and the plexiglass and everything, but this is the inside of a Gemini space capsule. Two-man crew in the cockpit of the Gemini space capsule. Here's another capsule over here. We'll look. Astronauts in various space suits. We'll take a look at those in just a minute. Is an Apollo 15 command module. And it says on at 9:34 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time on July 26, 1971, a giant Saturn V launch vehicle lifted off its pad at Kennedy Space Center in Florida, carrying Apollo 15 spacecraft. The command module of Colonel Davis R. Scott, Commander, Lieutenant Colonel James R. Irwin, Junior Modular Pilot and Major Alfred M. Warden, Junior Commander Modular Pilot. And this was the first all-U.S. Air Force Apollo crew. And they landed on the moon. This was the fourth expedition of lunar landing. And this is the Command 15 module, which actually landed on the moon, came back to Earth, and was recovered about 335 miles north of Hawaii. The Apollo 15 Command module, carrying Scott, Irwin, and Warden on their moon venture in 1971. To the moon and back, nothing flat. Marine unit, similar to some that might be used in outer space or on the moon. Here we have a zero-G power wrench. Here we have magnetic boots. Here we have a propulsion pistol. Would change your direction. It was a reaction propulsion pistol. This pistol-like device was tested in zero-gravity aircraft flights as a means of individual maneuvering in free fall. It was not adapted. Here's a space sextant. Here's a zero-G razor and a space can opener. Here we're looking now at a space sled, and it was not used, but it was developed that they could use it in outer space. Now we're looking at astronaut suits. Here's the Lytton suit in 1958, says the grandfather of U.S. Air Force and NASA space suits. Oh, look at that dude. Looks like something out of the medieval movies. Here's the next 15 pressure suit used by F-15 pilots as they flew 4,000 miles an hour, 50 miles above the space. Project Mercury space suits, 1961 vintage. Manned orbiting laboratory suit, 1963, used in the Gemini spacecraft. Here we go, maneuvering life support systems. Developed for extravehicular activities in space, the suit is one of the several concept studies which resulted in the manned maneuvering units used in Space Shuttle. This example contains a maneuvering apparatus as part of the suit assembled rather than a separate unit eventually adopted for shuttle use. This suit used coal gas propulsion system which provided through an umbilical line in the spacecraft, so they couldn't get too far from the spacecraft. Here's your Apollo space suit, 1969. So now we've entered the age of space. The National Air Space Plane projected as the X-30. Kitty Hawk to the moon. We have some other exhibits outside which we'll want to take. One is an A-10, a B-1 bomber, and several others. And again, the tail section. Okay, because of space limitations, some of the aircraft that are on display here are outside, and along with some of the missiles that adorn the front of the building here, our battery's running low and I want to get some of these aircraft in. You're looking here at a B-1A bomber, and we'll walk up and get a head shot of it in just a minute. The difference between the B-1A and the B-1B is that the B-1A stored its fuel in the wing, as does the B-1B, but because of the flex of the wing, there was so much leakage of the fuel that it created quite a problem. It was solved in the B-1B by using a rubber bladder in the wing, which actually keeps the fuel from leaking out while it's in flight, because these wings flex several feet at wingtip, creating some leakage in the aluminum plates. This is the tail section of an F-15. We've heard a lot about those recently. And of course, this is the tail of an A-10. This is an A-10. We're looking now at the F-15 twin tail. And of course, we've heard a lot about those in recent weeks. And the B-1 bomber sitting there behind it. A-10, the tank killer. The old Warthog, ugly. Nobody loves it, but it just does a job that nothing else seems to do. the A-10. One is a Streak Eagle, or called the Streak Eagle here, was placed into service in 1974 when the F-15s were introduced to the service. In July of 1975, it set several records from brake release and takeoff. In 3 minutes, 27 and 5/10 seconds, the plane reached an altitude of better than 93,000 feet. This airplane, because it has more thrust than the weight of the airplane, can accelerate in a vertical climb. In other words, it can go at straight up 90 degrees and accelerate in speed. After it had set this speed record, or this climb record, to 93,000 feet, it coasted to a little over 103,000 feet before descending. Quite an aircraft.
Yeah, pull back on the stick.
I said it climbed to 93,000. I was wrong. It climbed to 98,480 feet in 3 minutes and 27.5 seconds from brake release and takeoff. That's going right up in the air, and then it coasted to 103,000 feet before descending. One from the nose, you get some idea of it. We want to do a panoramic view of the Air Force Museum. What you see in the background is a new theater that is being built. It'll have a 40-foot screen on it. It'll be open the first part of May, and it will show movies. They're going to charge $4. There's over 1 million visitors come through here a year, and this money will be used for upkeep in the Air Force Museum. Most of it's maintained by private donations. There's just a view of some of the hangars. Again, the B-1. We're looking now over toward Wright-Patt. The tower you see there in the background is a laser. This is one of the engineering bases of the Air Force. It's Wright-Patterson Area B. It's not primarily an airplane where they land airplanes, but it's used for experiments, engineering designs. And there are some of the hangars. The one there with the Wright brothers picture on it, the Wright aircraft, that was painted and decorated. We were out here in the fall of 1988, at which time the Air Force was celebrating its 40th year. It was constituted a separate branch in 1948. Now we're looking at a row of aircraft that they don't have room to house in the hangars here, but we'll look at some of those. 5 Thunder Chief, developed during the mid-1950s, into service in the late 1950s, flown on demonstration by the Thunderbirds. Later is a National Guard airplane in New Jersey, an F-105. This is a Sikorsky helicopter used extensively in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, affectionately known as a Jolly Green Giant. Quite a bird. It's a Junkers Ju-52, German-made aircraft. It's a 3-engine, much like the DC-3, a German version made in the mid-1930s, used extensively by the Germans as a transport during World War II. And one similar to this was Adolf Hitler's own private airplane, the Junkers Ju-52, tri-motored. A cross between a Ford tri-motor and a DC-3. Now at a B-50. It's known as the WD B-50. Actually, it's built on the same principle as a B-29. It's a little larger, more powerful engines, more streamlined, and this was first developed in 1947 and served as our medium bomber until replaced by the B-47s in the early 1950s. But this simply is a modified B-29 known as a B-50, and there were several hundred. There were about 700 of these built and used. The Lucky Lady, a B-50, set a record by flying around the world non-stop in the early 1950s. B-50 is unusual. It's a B-20 mine, again modified as a B-50, but this is a KB-50 in the mid-50s when these became surplus. There were several hundred of these sitting around, and so they were converted to tankers to refuel jet aircraft. And to increase the speed, you'll notice that jet engines have been added. And the B-50 is a B-50 with a 3-engine, much like the DC-3, a German version made in the mid-1930s, used extensively by the Germans as a transport during World War II. And one similar to this was Adolf Hitler's own private airplane, the Junkers Ju-52, tri-motored. A cross between a Ford tri-motor and a DC-3. 135s in the middle 1960s. Is a Lockheed Constellation. It was known as a triple nickel because of the 555 identification number on the airplane. It was one of the first radar airplanes, a forerunner of our present-day AWACS airplanes. These began service in 1953, patrolling the DEW system around the perimeter of the United States defense. Early warning, which meant defense early warning, I guess, in the 1950s. It was upgraded, and in the Vietnam conflict over Vietnam, it was actually used to direct our fighter planes as they went into combat by locating the MiG-21s and being able to position our airplanes where we had the advantage. Probably the forerunner of the AWACS, the old Lockheed Constellation. And again, this same airplane, minus the pod on top and the bucket underneath, was identical to the one that President Eisenhower used, the old Lockheed Constellations. 135. Now this airplane is one that has been used in a variety of configurations. It was first flown as the 707. The military acquired it, scaled it down, and used it as a 135 tanker. It was used as a 707 on commercial flights and is still in service. Today, the pod on the top has been changed and it's called the AWACS aircraft. Basically the same airplane as what you see here, except the pod has changed. And this pod was unusual because it was used in the 1950s, and it's a laser testing pod. And the round dome here on the front actually contained a laser, and they used it to research and to develop the laser as a guided means of light seeking, or whatever it is, beam, to destroy and to use it in a combat mode. But this is upgraded, the military version of the KC-135 tanker. This is